This time on Poll Hub, it's all about the executive branch. With Donald Trump wielding more executive power than any president since FDR, we're asking, do checks and balances really hold up, or can things slip through the cracks? Americans seem to be split. Then, with summer creeping up on us, we look at how this season might shape up very differently for families nationwide, thanks to the Trump administration's budget cuts to the National Park Service. Did the economic benefits outweigh the safety risks? And did Americans even ask for this? Finally, it's brains versus brawn in this week's Fun Fact, on a topic that nearly every American seems to have an opinion on. Stick around.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Neil Viswanathan.
I'm AJ Gambino.
And I'm Lee Marigoff.
Well, there certainly has been no shortage of news coming out of Washington this week. A lot of focus on tariffs, and more tariffs. But we wanted to weigh in not so much on the issue of whether tariffs are good or bad or here or gone, but about presidential power and what exactly is the power of the executive branch. Do the checks and balances consistently apply, or can certain things change with administration from administration? This certainly isn't anything new to the presidency, but I think there hasn't been a president probably since FDR that has tested the boundaries of the presidency. Taking a look at some of the polling on these issues, we can start with our own Marist poll done just last month, where 56% of U.S. adults either disagree or strongly disagree that the nation's systems of checks and balances is actually working well. Now, not surprisingly, that includes 79% of Democrats and 64% of independents. 72% of Republicans, however, strongly agree that system is functioning effectively. I'd like to jump back, since I mentioned FDR, I'd like to jump back in our time machine and look at a July 1937 Gallup poll, who also asked adults whether or not the president should have more or less power. And at that time, the plurality said, no, things are probably going along okay. 32% thought the president should have less power, and 18% thought that the president should have more. I think this is something that kind of goes back and forth depending upon whether you're comfortable with the occupant of the White House or not. We certainly do seem to be in unprecedented times in terms of how President Trump has taken the reins of the country, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. With gridlock in Congress having become so normal, do you think we were actually forcing President Trump to stretch the powers of the presidency to get stuff done, or has he crossed a line? Lee, do you want to chime in, both in terms of your impressions now and historically?
Well, I think that what we're seeing now is an odd situation. Not only do you have President Trump sort of now trying to do some of the things that he didn't seem ready to do in his first term. They really were not up to speed when they took office in 2017. Now they seem to have really got a playbook to work with. So they've moved off the starting blocks very quickly and very aggressively. Accompanied with that, when you talk about checks and balances, you have a unique situation where the Republicans control the House, even if by a razor-thin majority, and they control the Senate, and they control, for all intents and purposes, the Supreme Court. So what you have is a situation where Republicans, in a sense, have to go against a very strong, bully pulpit, aggressive member of their own party in Donald Trump. And they've been obviously very reluctant to do so. And in fact, some say right now that the Republican Party is really the MAGA party, that he has, by threats of running primaries against incumbent Republicans who might stray off the farm a little bit, he's able to command pretty much 100% allegiance on things.
Yeah, I mean, I know you're older enough to remember a lot of presidents, but not FDR, even though you were born and lived in an area where he did as well and where he was from, the Hudson Valley in New York State. But the comparisons that many Republicans make to FDR, do you think that holds water? Or do you think we are actually looking at something that is very different?
Well, I think it's different because the rules seem to have been broken, and Congress doesn't seem to be driving the power of the purse, which is, obviously granted them in the Constitution. And I think in FDR's case, where he did have a huge popular mandate, starting with 1932 and all the subsequent landslides, Donald Trump mandate is very, very thin, in terms of the popular vote. That nonetheless, he's really been driving that as hard as he can in the first 100 days of his administration. And he really is able to not only command the allegiance of his party in Congress, but recently Chuck Schumer, as folks know, sort of in terms of the continuing resolution, drew the ire of some Democrats by not drawing a line in the sand. And so within the Democratic Party, you have an opposite picture. The Republicans are falling in line here. They're pretty much taking Trump's cues and climbing on board. In the Democrats, you've got a clear split generationally between those who, kind of like more traditional institutionalists like Schumer and a more progressive element like Bernie Sanders and AOC, and reference all the protests that were occurring just this past weekend in terms of the Democrats trying to rally their resistance to what President Trump and Congress is doing. I'm also thinking, when you talk about Roosevelt, I'm thinking about his efforts to stack the Supreme Court, which were an imbalance potential for him because he wasn't necessarily getting his way with the Supreme Court declaring some of the New Deal unconstitutional, and the answer for him was stuffing the court. And that actually didn't obviously go through. But we have a very changing role for the president. It's not just commanding national attention. It's not just setting the agenda. It's not just, having the power to persuade, as Richard Neustadt in his book In Different Eras so famously talked about the presidential power. He's really driving the direction of the nation right now, and it's coming out of the executive office, and a lot of what he's doing will or will not be granted approval by the Supreme Court. And right now, those are kind of some mixed votes coming in, but it's a very, very different picture, which tests some of the constitutional rules to the limit and also brings into question just how well the checks and balances really are working now. And I think it is a unique time, not just kind of like the usual my guy's in power and your guy's not kind of thing. I think this is an unusual and very unique time that way.
I mean, there have been a couple of votes that have been very significant out of the Supreme Court. Do you find that surprising? I mean, recognizing that it is a court that Trump had a very significant hand in putting together, but their decisions on deportation, their decisions on whether federal workers can go back to work. I mean, I know that those were narrow cases that were brought to them, but nonetheless, Trump has certainly gotten significant support in those two very large issues and directional acts that he has performed from the Supreme Court. Is that just politics, or is this really an ideological direction and turn that this party, the Republican Party, is taking the country?
Right now, I think it's a clear change in the basis and the foundation that we're going forward. Some of these cases at one level, the appellate division, the different federal judges are stepping in front of the agenda and then of the Trump agenda, and then find themselves being reversed at the Supreme Court level. There's no doubt that Trump isn't shy when a judge goes against him, not on the Supreme Court. I'm seeing some of the federal judges where, he calls them a radical left when, judge, which doesn't capture them at all. There's been rulings in the last couple of days. And in the fine print, you realize that the judge in a recent case was actually a Trump appointee at the federal bench. So these are hardly people who are Bernie Sanders lookalikes ideologically, but there are very often just jurists who are not happy with what the balance of the power is. So, I mean, it is a new day. We don't know the limits yet. There's still major test cases. The most recent case I referred to is the freedom of the press, the battle with the Associated Press.
VAT.
Yeah, and that judge was actually a Trump appointee who sided with the AP. Now, what does that case make it to the Supreme Court? And does the Supreme Court reverse the lower court, which they have done in other instances? That remains to be seen. I don't know whether we've tested the limits of how far President Trump and his team are going to go or try to go. And down the road, he alludes to the fact that, hey, I may hang around for another term. And that obviously would also put the Constitution on the test, because it's very clear as to what it says on that and the limits to the number of years terms you can serve.
Well, tariffs have certainly changed, I think, a lot of the discussion. Could these tariffs, if not, as Trump is talking about, are just points of negotiation, if these negotiations don't seem to be going the way he anticipated and the market continues to flounder, could this be the turning point?
Well, the folks in Washington, surprise or surprise, are political people, whether they're elected or appointed. And if Trump's handling of the economy because of the tariffs takes a dive, he will find himself with far fewer friends than he might have right now. And that would apply to judges as well. I find it interesting that some of the Supreme Court rulings favor Trump, but by a 5-4 margin. The bench is 6-3 in terms of all things being equal, supporting Trump. Well, it's been 5-4 in some cases, and he's actually lost an occasional 5-4. If the economy gets into some major problems because of the tariff, Trump has been so active, he will not be able to point a finger and say, this was Biden's doing. They may try, but it won't be that successful. Tariff is his policy. And if it does have a problem, if we do find ourselves in a recession or a depression, I think his power from the bully pulpit will be greatly weakened, regardless of these other initiatives he has, which may not even be related to the economy. It's just his so-called mandate will be greatly tarnished if that happens. But we're not there yet. We'll have to see.
Absolutely. And certainly a lot more to talk about going forward. But right now, I'd like to bring in our student producer, Neil. You have a special topic here that you have been very interested in discussing. So take it away.
Speaking of presidential power, next we're going to talk about an institution that has faced severe budget cuts recently from the executive branch, national parks. National parks have long been beloved destinations for visitors looking to connect with nature and experience a pre-industrialized America. With recent budget cuts, however, under the Trump administration, the future of these protected areas are uncertain. Diving into the data, an overwhelming majority of voters support increasing or keeping funding the same for our national parks and forests. Data for Progress in February 2025 found that 83% of likely voters supported increasing or keeping funding the same for national parks, and that only 10% of Americans believe that funding should be decreased. As of February 2025, however, the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Services had laid off more than 3,000 workers in an effort to cut federal spending. These workers included park rangers, staff at visitor centers, and trail maintainers. This is coming despite a record-breaking 331.9 million people visiting national parks in 2024, the highest yearly total ever. Further establishing that these cuts in funding were not necessitated by the wants of Americans. According to a Pew survey conducted in June 2024, 76% of Americans held a favorable view of the National Park Service, making it the most positively viewed federal agency. Also from Pew, in June 2023, only 8% of Americans thought that the government was doing too much to protect land in national parks. In a poll that we conducted in December 2013, sponsored by McClatchy, 59% of Americans deemed it unacceptable to increase fees at national parks in order to avoid further government spending cuts. With all that being said, Liam, Barb, in your lifetimes, have you guys ever seen such large cuts to a widely beloved and publicly supported institution such as national parks, or is this unprecedented?
Well, certainly what we have been seeing in the cutbacks that we have seen at the federal level, which have not been concentrated in any kind of policy direction other than to reduce federal spending. I think this, again, like what we were talking about with the economy, is something that directly impacts most Americans. Most of us have hit the road, particularly during the vacation seasons, to visit state parks. They're part of many communities around the country. Granted, they're just over, 100 years old. It was actually President Teddy Roosevelt. We were talking about the other Roosevelt in the earlier segment. But it was Teddy Roosevelt that decided that we needed to have an investment in our national parks and set aside large tracts of land for future generations to see and understand what this country was made of and built from. So I think the national parks are certainly something that is central to the fabric of the country. It's a vacation destination. It's the backbone of many communities in terms of tourism. And I think that there's going to be pretty significant repercussions as people realize that those things are not available. I'm not sure that the economic benefits of developing those lands can outweigh the view that many Americans do feel that these are national treasures and should still exist for future generations.
Yeah, you mentioned tourism, and that's obviously, just a huge factor in supporting local economies that are, where the residents are employed, or, just the local economy and, in terms of housing and food. And I mean, it's so dependent on the summer travel. When the gas prices were high, there was a concern that would affect tourism. The one thing also that's affecting tourism is the notion that people from other countries, like Canada, may not be as eager in the current climate to kind of cross the border and now visit what has been a very often used destination for their summer vacations. So I think this is like something that, it's not a policy that, is targeted. Obviously, lower income people, the middle class, who really take advantage of these, utilize these parks, may feel a little shut out. But it's also going to affect the international visitation as well. And I think we may see, there's still a few months to go, and we may see a weakening of the direction of this policy. Congressmen in their districts, many might be red states, red areas, are going to push back, as they have in other areas like agriculture, to the direction of the tariffs. And Trump does present himself, as somebody who's a negotiator, and that he throws this out and then he likes to pull back a little bit, get some of what he wants. In this case, I would be very surprised if, he gets the cart full of the kinds of changes he's trying to make in terms of hours, in terms of places being closed altogether, the number of Park Service rangers helping out, they provide a safety function, they provide, an information function, and they sort of have been very much a fabric of the National Park Service. And I think that, this may be one that, put it in the category of overreach, this may be one of the policies that has overreach.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the drawbacks of cutting all this funding and staffing, because according to Backpacker in February 2024, almost 4,000 people died in national parks between 2007 and 2023. These budget cuts could lead to vulnerabilities in fire scouting and thus lead to an increase in forest fires, and also lead to a drastic decrease in environmental education.
I think one of the things that I find interesting about this period of time, and recognize we haven't even reached 100 days of the Trump administration, which is kind of the usual check-in to see, how the country is doing on the new president's watch. But I think, over time, the country has experienced rather significant economic upheavals. We can look to the deindustrialization of manufacturing in the 70s, the building of our information economy in the 90s and the 2000s. But I think one of the really big differences is that this upheaval is being managed and directed from government, where in the past, government has taken a role to buffer people from the detriments of economic upheaval. In this instance, it's being directed from Washington. So normal safety nets and supports, I'm not really referring just to entitlements in this instance, but supports to communities in terms of other economic supports that government has often provided is now actually being taken away. So in that sense, this is a very unique time because government is actually the impetus for all of these changes rather than it coming from some other economic sector or some other disruption in a particular industry. And so there is no safety net for many, particularly in more vulnerable communities and more rural communities. The other thing I did want to mention, too, is that the federal government is the biggest employer of veterans there is. And one of the places that many veterans have found employment is in the Park Service. And so I think that's particularly concerning, even when we look at some of the other federal cutbacks, when you think about the fact that the government has been there not only to support these natural treasures that everybody has been able to enjoy, but has also been there to support people who have given their service to the country. It does, I think, undermine the fabric and really the foundation of this country and what we stand for.
Yeah, and I think if you're talking about, messaging out of the White House, they already have sort of put into play the notion of, short-term blame, long-term gain, which is, sort of a stay the course. I think, there's already some talk about the midterm elections, and I think there's a little bit of a concern emerging among Republicans in Congress that this may cause, among other things, some hardship that will be difficult to overcome. And still, it's obviously a long way off, but the midterms around. Look, is there an appetite for this? Is there an appetite for cutting costs in public opinion at the parks? Not really. That's what the numbers suggest. So President Trump is likely to face strong headwinds on this. And if it's coming from districts where Republican congressmen, those headwinds will blow strong. And we'll see what he does in the face of that.
Yes, and it'll be definitely a different summer for many families, not just because of the closing and the shortened hours within our national parks, but also as we watch unemployment continue to rise. It will certainly force families to adjust their plans.
Let's move on to a somewhat lighter topic, although what I think will have strong opinions nonetheless, and that is a poll which was conducted by CBS News in 2012. I read this. I had no problems thinking what I would go for an answer with, but the question supplied by the Roper Center at Cornell, our friends up there who serve as a source for this information, if you could wake up tomorrow and become one of the following without any schooling or any effort, would you choose to become a martial arts expert or a fine arts expert? Martial arts gets 29%, I'm sure generationally and gender influenced. Fine arts expert goes for 67. I'm not even, this is so obvious for me. I'm not even going there.
Really? Okay. So what did you decide?
Well, fine arts has to be much more acceptable. Can you envision me in a martial arts, even if it did not involve any schooling or training or that's so not my cup of tea.
Oh, interesting. Because see, I chose martial arts. And the reason is if I could just wake up without any kind of training or effort and be that disciplined and that strong and that controlled, I would do it in a minute. I mean, think about all the things that, you could do. I would be, hiking without getting out of breath after the third mile. I'd be...
You're working the bars along with your horse. You're flipping those bales of hay two at a time, I guess.
Exactly. I'd be lifting, a couple of 50-pound bags of feed. I wouldn't have to make all of those trips back and forth to my car. I would absolutely love it.
Okay, let's go next generation. Don't forsake me on this one, guys. I mean, I have you guys pinned for martial arts experts. Neil, what do you got?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Barb. I would definitely choose to be a martial arts expert. I feel like it would open up a whole other kind of world for me, like going into any building, anytime, knowing you could beat anybody up. Like it's a whole world of self-confidence that could pay off in pretty much every aspect of your life.
Do you run across another similarly inclined martial
Well,
arts?
because I also think if this, it's martial arts don't create bullies. They create disciplined people who can defend themselves and who are physically fit and mentally fit. So yeah, yay, Neil.
Yeah, Barb advancing
Fist bump.
the deterrent effect here of martial arts. No one's going to gotten you. I'm short. I'm not very strong. I just hang around with a lot of big people who are stronger.
So there you go. So Neil and I will,
protect you.
we'll be your entourage.
Okay, AJ, you going martial arts as well?
I'm going to go with Lee and go with fine arts. I feel like it'd be more practical. Like I'd be able to use my skills more. Like I don't know how many situations I'm going to need to be a martial arts expert in, but I would want more specifics on, is it one type of martial arts that you're good at, or is it every type? And same thing with like fine arts. Are you just like a really good painter, or can you just do everything? I think that would impact my choice as well.
Yeah, they are broad categories, and we don't know exactly what the question, as we say in the polling business, whatever it means to you. So if it's fine arts, it's whatever part of it you want to sink your teeth into. But we have a real split here, and it's not by generations.
Well, you know what I find really interesting is often when we find these questions, there are quite a number of people who say that they don't know or they don't answer. Only 4% of Americans didn't have an opinion on this, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I know. I noticed that as well. And this is one everybody can weigh in on. We had no problems with this ourselves. We just went right to the chase. So I do point out, I noticed that this is our 390th podcast, dating whatever 52 divided by 390 is. It's a long time. And I understand you guys I don't want you to, spoil it, spoiler alert, but I understand you guys are working for a super duper 400th celebration podcast. Is that true? And that's as far as I want to know at this point.
It is true. I can't really spill the details yet, but it will be a very special episode, and I think all of our viewers will really enjoy it.
Okay, so it's 10 away, countdown to that. And I don't know what you got in store. I don't know what you're brewing there, but I feel like it will be special, and we will be advertising that as we get closer. But this is 390, so we're only 10 away.
This is the first tease, Holly.
First tease. Have a good week, everybody.
That'll do it for Poll Hut this week. Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Neil Viswanathan, Enter Petro, and AJ Gambino.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.